I did go into journalism for the same reason that many of us do, which is that I thought I could make a difference in some way. This was in the late 80s. So I had been, marching, Take Back the Night marches, pro-choice marches. You have to remember it was only 1988 when the Supreme Court struck down the abortion law in this country. So it was a different landscape, but in many unfortunate ways, it was a very similar landscape to what we experience now. And I was asked if I would take over this opinion column. So I did. That was 2011. And then I, for the next 11 years, wrote a column in the Saturday opinion section, and as well as features. I wrote a lot of features, and the columns were, I've gone back and looked at some of them, and there is progress made. There has been a lot of progress made in many areas. So I'm not going to say there hasn't, but so many of the problems are the same as they were 11 years ago or 30 years ago when I first started writing. But in terms of how we deal with intimate partner violence, well, we're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Interval House. And I don't think anybody who was part of that absolutely pioneering, amazing movement in the 70s across Canada to set up women's shelters thought that we would be here in 50 years dealing with the same issues around funding and secrecy and shame and trouble reporting to the police and backlash. It's astonishing to me in some ways that we have not made more progress. I mean, I think just in recognizing the scope of the problem, that it's not, you saw 50 years ago, you had these headlines about, battered wives fleeing their husbands kind of thing. And I think we've realized now this is not a problem of individuals, it's a problem of society in general, and it's only going to be solved as a whole of society problem. It doesn't affect certain people, it affects people from across society. I think we're starting to study it more in terms of academics looking at it. I think there are more connections being made globally and internationally, looking at what are solutions or best practices that could be implemented in different jurisdictions. And we're also understanding that although it is a universal problem, it is one that affects women differently if they come from different parts of society. Marginalized women experience this violence, racialized women, newcomers to Canada experience this issue differently and need to have different solutions in place. Well, I think what Interval House has done that's so interesting is help women all through the continuum of their challenges or their, recovery. So it's not just about helping people and families, in that moment of crisis. It's about getting them back on their feet, which I think is what Interval House does so well, like career counseling or offering, housing support and things like that, and making sure that people are confident enough to do a job interview. That's enormous, I think, because I think we still tend to think of this as an acute issue of a thing that happens at one point in time and then you solve it and it's over. It's not, it's a chronic thing. So people need help all the way along their path to to a new life. And it seems to me that's what Interval House has done really well, which is take that holistic whole approach to the subject and to individuals and their families to help them get back on their feet. We live in a deeply misogynist society, I think, is what I would say. And so I try to draw the dots between, politics and culture and sports and criminal justice and all of these different fields, because what we are up against is a society that has been scaffolded to protect the interests of men, largely white men, for millennia, right? So we're trying to dismantle this, and it takes time. We need to understand that this is not just, so this gender-based violence thing is not just over here existing by itself, and Brittany Griner being ignored in a Russian prison isn't over here by itself. These things are connected. They're all connected in a system of oppressions we're kind of blind to because we grow up thinking that they're normal. And so this is why I say it's going to be an all of society response. We need to dismantle the things that we have learned as normal and reconstruct something that is more just and fair and equitable for everyone. I guess what I was trying to do was, and what I tried to do is to say, yeah, that these things that are happening in the culture are not separate from things that are happening in people's lives. They are all tied together, and the solutions are going to have to all be tied together as well. Where technology and social media platforms allow people to come together for purposes of like protest and social justice movements and human rights, they also allow people to come together for purposes of hate and undermining social justice. And that's absolutely what we've seen. Gamergate was 8 years ago, right? And, you know, if anything, it's gotten worse. We see that now with the online abuse of journalists and of politicians, women, particularly racialized women. These are organized campaigns designed to get people to be silent, to stop speaking out about their rights. And that ties back to gender-based violence, because at the very heart of what we call domestic violence is this idea of that it is cloaked in shame, unfortunately, the shame, and it's the shame of the victim, whereas it should be the shame of the perpetrator. The other thing that happens in the online world is that technology is now being used as a form of abuse, as we know, very commonly with young women. They're being, you know, they might be stalked through, you know, tracking devices or their phones. Digital abuse has become a huge problem for. So back in the day, you would get angry hate mail, but it came by mail and somebody had to, you know, take the trouble to lick a stamp and put it in the post box. So things arrived more slowly. Then email came and I got a lot of, hey, man hating, see you next Tuesday. And journalists, women journalists were just expected to kind of slough it off. You might have joked about it with somebody over a beer in a bar, but there was nothing organized to help you ever. You just put it down as one of the hazards of the job. What happened with social media recently, but it's actually been going on for, you know, probably the past 10 years, ramped up much more in the past 2 years, is there are organized campaigns egged on by the right-wing politicians to try to silence women journalists. They target women journalists, and they particularly target racialized women journalists with death threats, with threats of sexual violence. We just saw a really good conversation the other day from the Canadian Association of Journalists on this topic. And it is with the purpose, these organized campaigns, of silencing women. First of all, by trying to get them to be afraid or anxious or all of these other things. And secondly, by essentially giving them a second whole full-time job, which is putting out these fires or responding to these trolls and idiots. What we need to do, what everybody else needs to do, is to very forcefully and vocally speak up about this. And especially if you have a position of privilege, if you have a platform, if you have even a tiny bit of power, it is on you to speak up and say, this is not on, it's not cool, it's terrible, it's organized, and it has to stop. A lot of, I think, what this is about fear of change, it's about fear of progress, it's about fear of having to, give up something. This is how they perceive it, that they have to give up something, which other people are gaining, as if it's a zero-sum game. It is not a zero-sum game. Just because women or racialized people or people of different abilities or different genders are gaining something doesn't mean that you're losing. But I think we have a small segment of the population which is very loud, which is afraid of how the world is changing. If you think about it, the three of the largest mass murders in Canadian history, in recent Canadian history, started with acts of misogynist violence. So the van attack in Toronto, the mass slaying that happened in Nova Scotia, in Portapique, Nova Scotia, began with an incident of domestic violence. And of course, the Montreal Massacre, the most explicit of those three. What we cannot ignore is that misogyny and domestic violence are at the root of so many mass killings, especially in the United States. There are people who track this, the number of mass killings that begin in an act of domestic violence, or where the family is a central are the central victims in a mass killing. Why we don't think about that more, study it more, make it harder for people who are convicted of gender-based violence to get weapons and things like that. There are all these kinds of loopholes. Why we don't better train police and courts, I don't know. That's the big question mark hanging all over it. And some of that is changing a little bit now. We just had the Cures Law legislation in Ontario, which is private members bill, which will hopefully ensure that lawyers and judges get better training in issues around domestic violence, so that they can use them when they're trying cases or hearing cases. So that's actually a big step forward. So in reporting I've done over the years, and then we did this, my colleagues Molly Hayes and Tavia Grant and I did a series on intimate partner violence this year for the Globe. And the thing everybody says is prevention. Everybody says the same thing: prevention, prevention, prevention. Very, very, very little money gets spent on prevention, unfortunately. So, and by prevention, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different ways we could talk about this, but let's say just in terms of education, starting very, very early on, every child in this country should be taught about consent. They should be taught about healthy relationships. They should be taught about emotional management, all of this stuff that's hugely important. When we interviewed men who, we talked to a bunch of men who were abusive in their relationships. And it was really very touching and sad to hear how many of them said that they were told when they were little boys that, they should just suck it up. They should stop crying. They should, get over it. You're a man, grow up. They were taught to fear and suppress their emotions. So we have to look at how we socialize boys and girls from a very early age. And so that's one thing that needs to happen. And then the other big thing that needs to happen, and it doesn't, is there is nowhere for men to go who are feeling like they might become abusive or are abusive, and their partners maybe have said, this has to end, it has to stop, you need to get help. There's nowhere to get help. There's really nowhere to go. There are so few programs across the country, and the ones that do exist are underfunded, and or they fall by the wayside, or there was a case of this really good study that showed that this one program was very useful for high risk men who are at high risk of reoffending, and then the study funding ran out so that they couldn't continue it. And it just kind of blows your mind because, and every expert said to us, we keep, focusing on women. We need to focus on men. We need to focus on, and here I will say that yes, men can also be the victims of domestic abuse. Absolutely. But the preponderance of abuse happens towards women, and it's more severe, and it affects children more. So that needs to happen. I've written about this before. I would watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette with my daughter. Again, it's like the whole idea of the sugar that helps the medicine go down. We would watch it and I'd be like, why do you think they all have the same body? And why are they all, reacting to, men in the same way? And do you think that man is being too controlling over that woman's behavior? And, I tried to be on it from the beginning, to the point, as I say, where they just roll their eyes at me. So you can use culture and the best programs. And I wrote about a few of the programs around healthy relationships. Taught properly, they do incorporate the stuff that's going on in the world, so that, after or during the Amber Heard trial, the teacher might say to, let's say you've got a group of 12 or 13-year-olds, you might say to them, you guys following this? What do you think about this? And not in a didactic, preachy way, not in a this is bad, but in a, do you see this happening with your friends and in their relationships? Is this kind of thing happening? And how do you deal with it? And just as a way of engaging them. And I think that can be, it can be very powerful. Many advocacy groups have come up with sort of wonderful, what I can do as an ally, kind of a thing. And I think, yes, you could donate money or time to a shelter, for example. You could make sure that you're raising your children in a kind of a way that recognizes equality and fairness as foundational principles. But the other thing I think that people can do is kind of educate themselves about what intimate partner violence or domestic violence actually looks like. And people think it looks like, we're still stuck in this kind of 1970s thinking, I think, that it looks like physical violence. And yes, it can incorporate physical violence, absolutely. But the spectrum is so much wider and more insidious. So violence can also incorporate what we call coercive control, which is one partner trying to manipulate the other one for their own ends. It can incorporate financial violence, psychological abuse, as we were saying, digital harassment or stalking, sexual violence, all these, diminishing another person. So think about, in your own relationships with people, is there something that seems slightly off? Let's say one of your friends or your family members, you think, oh, that relationship seems kind of weird to me. Is the one partner trying to control the other one? Are they constantly phoning or texting? Are they restricting their partner's access to an ATM, let's say, or to a phone, or to phone cards, or to credit cards? Are they telling them where they can be at a particular time? Are they always putting them down? Are they being emotionally abusive? These are things to be on the lookout for. And then maybe you have the courage to have a conversation with that person and say, in a very safe place, like not obviously when the potentially abusive partner is around, and you say, is everything okay? I just noticed this and I wanted to make sure that everything's good with you, because sometimes these things can escalate, they can become worse, they can lead to physical violence. In the very most extreme cases, they can lead to extreme physical violence and even death. But you might want to just say to somebody, I'm checking in, I care about you, I'm here for you if you need me to talk to you, to somebody to talk to about this. And after that series we ran on intimate partner violence, large number of people. The first part was series installment was about coercive control. And a huge number of people got in touch and said, I had no idea that that was actually considered abusive. And I noticed it in my, my friend or my sister or my roommate or, my old college roommate. I noticed that that was the pattern of their relationship. And I wish I'd known it at the time. And now kind of I do. So that's what I would say. Educate yourself about the kind of the wider spectrum of what abuse actually is. And then also just lobby politicians for, there's so much we don't have, stable funding or a national crisis line, which would be hugely helpful. All of these things, more funding for healthy relationships programming. So make those a priority when you're voting. Think about that too.